Today on the show, we have Kyle Dobbs. It's always weird saying my own name out loud, but we got Kyle Dobbs on the show. I have to say that I'm a huge fan of you, man. I found you right before the pandemic, took the Compound Performance mentorship. I think I was like second cohort.
You were one of the first ones, I think.
Yeah. I remember having like the quick little like 30-minute one-on-one call with you. And I'm like, dude, I lost my job. I did all this stuff. Like, what do I do? And you're like, take the mentorship. But definitely the best decision I ever made. All the stuff you taught definitely helped me with everything I do today, and I've built from there. So yeah, just again, thank you. If you haven't taken the Compound Performance mentorship and you're a coach, you definitely should, but I'll stop blowing you up here. So Kyle, how about you give us the elevator pitch, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. And I'm definitely under the philosophy that it's like two Kyles are better than one. So we're like Kyle squared right now. And I feel like this is definitely going to be a good podcast because of that. No, I really appreciate that. And, you know, you're definitely somebody that I've enjoyed watching like grow through the last three or so years. It has been almost 4 years, I think, since we first talked, which is crazy to think about. And it's been fun to watch you kind of go from like the more in-house employee-based setting to like running your own shop and doing all these things. And I love your post. It definitely challenges me as well and makes me think about things. And I enjoy that aspect of social media more so than anything else. And for me, I've kind of give the short one. I've been in the industry for just at 15 years, maybe a little bit over at this point, as a coach, just a personal trainer, and then as a manager, a multi-facility manager, a district manager, and then worked on the national level as a director for a few different companies. And then about 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, my wife and I decided to pack the kids up and, you know, move from New York, where we were living at the time, back to the Midwest and try to slow things down a little bit. And I ended up starting my own business, which is completely remote. And I had no idea how to manage at the time and didn't really know what I was getting into, but have slowly just figured it out through a series of mistakes and triumphs. And now I've got Compound Performance as a company LLC, which I'm primary owner of, and have 5 employees under that business. And we've worked with over 2021, we worked with over 1,000 coaches, you know, within all of our programs, which was awesome. That was a big milestone for us. And we also just launched a tech company and platform with the Compound app, where we're working on a training platform for coaches as phase 1 and getting into gym management software and then corporate wellness down the road. And it's looking at a kind of a three-phase progression model with that. So I'm learning a whole lot there too, and getting to be just really stupid all over again, which is always terrifying, but fun. And yeah, I mean, outside of that, I just, you know, I'm a dad. I've got, you know, 2 kids who are now 8 and 11. And as we were talking about off air, that's my favorite thing to do, taking them to their sports stuff and their practices and everything else, listening to their stories about school and eating dinner and hanging out. And my wife and I have been married for just over 12 years now. She's my best friend. She's awesome. And we've got a almost 2-year-old puppy who's a maniac, and that is Coach Bowser. If you follow me on social media, he's sleeping on the couch. I'm surprised we can't hear him snoring right now. I had to walk him before this and wear him down a little bit. So
I literally just walked my dog before this as well.
Otherwise he's nuts. If I'm on a call and I'm not giving him attention, he'll literally start eating the rug that's right by my desk. He'll just start chewing on it. It's just...
Mine will grab this duck here for the people that can't see it. It's a blue duck, and he finds the squeaker and he'll hold it on my lap and just over and over and over.
I love it. I love it, man.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. I am curious to kind of hear. So, I mean, you got your kids and everything, and then coming from, because you played ball in college, right?
Yeah, I originally went to school. It was a weird story. I went to school for track. I was a 400 runner and played basketball through high school and got some smaller college offers, and ended up going the track route and walked onto the basketball team at the university that I was at. And my first summer of track, I actually tore my hip labrum and a partial hip flexor, and it just kind of killed my track career. At that point, I just never really got up to the speed and the comfort level that I needed for the events that I was running. But I was able to continue on with basketball. And so, so I stuck with that. I ended up having several more injuries. I'm apparently made of glass was kind of my thing. But I had 2 knee injuries and a shoulder injury all through school as well. So I ended up basically spending a lot of time in the training room and not a lot of time on the court. But, I'm the cliche story of the guy who was always hurt that fell in love with the training process and got obsessed with strength and conditioning, kind of along the way. And I was also a pre-med major. So I was a double major in biology and chemistry with a minor in physical science. So that was also super intriguing to me from that respect, where I really was learning physiology, anatomy and physiology kind of through the process of also rehabbing and training, which just kind of lit a fire under me, to be honest. And I ended up not going to med school. I probably didn't have the grades for it anyway, to be honest. I didn't take school as seriously as I should have. But graduated, had my undergrad, got my CSCS right out of school, and started training almost immediately, from that point on, and became really passionate about it.
How'd you tear your hip labrum? What'd you do?
So I was working on start. So I was a 400 runner, and in high school and through AAU, I was good enough that I didn't really have to come out of blocks. As a taller runner, I just wasn't comfortable really coming out. I'm 6'4", coming out of blocks. And so I was decent enough at a standing start where I could catch people kind of on the third split a lot of the time. And when I got into college, everybody was just better. And I really had to work on that limitation of kind of my first 100 split, where I was too slow out of the start, and I was working on coming out of the blocks. And I don't know if I was just fatigued or what. I was practicing after practice, of course, because that's what young and dumb kids do. And yeah, I kind of went in like that first phase of stance, and my heel kind of hit the ground, and I subluxed my femur, and kind of tore through a little bit of my hip labrum. I also had like an iliacus strain, a fairly significant one, and a TFL, and just collapsed like a kind of a wall of bricks, at that point. And it was pretty gnarly. It was not fun.
Yeah. Did you go the surgery route, or did you just rehab?
Yeah, I got it scoped. The labrum was the only thing they actually had. Everything else was just strained. So they scoped the labrum, and it ended up being like a 5 to 6 month rehab. And then I came back and I went into playing ball, and almost immediately had a full dislocation of my patella, a meniscus tear, and an MCL tear.
Jeez, man.
Yeah, like I like a month afterwards. And so I ended up being in rehab for almost 12 out of 13 months. My kneecap was like behind my knee as I was laying. It was absolutely gross. And yeah, I just never really came back from that. Like, I was a practice player, and a cheerleader on the bench, basically, is what it turned into. So, but again, I wasn't ever going to be the star player anyway. So it was just fun being on the team and doing all the stuff at that point.
Yeah, definitely. No, that it's funny that you mentioned all this, because I tore my hip labrum in track. I ran 110 hurdles, and it actually started. So I got a concussion. They had us practicing because it was raining that day. So they're like, oh, let's practice indoors and let's go run hurdles indoors. Ooh. Yeah. So I'm like doing my thing. I'm like, this is kind of dumb. So I take off, and I end up like running straight through. I cracked the hurdle in half. And in doing that, it like pops up. I go flying, I smack my head, and then I wake up and I'm in the trainer's office. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, what's going on? I've got like blood all over the place. And they're like, you walked all the way down here. I'm like, I don't remember walking at all. Yeah. So having concussion, and then, now knowing what we know about concussions, it's like after that, and I got cleared and everything, everything just kind of started going downhill. And then it was like junior year track. I was running 110 hurdles and went over another hurdle and landed like outstretched, just same kind of thing, just like clunk.
Pretty much what happened to me is with that.
Yeah.
Just overstrided and boom.
Yeah. The only difference, I didn't go surgery route. I honestly I was dumb about it. I was like, I'll just stretch my hamstrings more. I'll be fine.
I didn't really have a choice in full transparent. They pretty much, we had a sports med program attached to the university, and they pretty much, I went to the training room and she booked me for like 2 days later, basically.
Dang.
So
see, I did in high school. And so it was like, I guess, I also didn't really talk about it. You had a
concussion and they were like, yeah, just drive home. You're fine. You're okay.
No, my mom came and picked me up that day. They like called her. And of course, she's like, I'm glad I bought the sports insurance. Like, geez, what the heck? But yeah, man, I had like 15 stitches across my head. I walked in and they're like, oh yeah, just go back to class. And my grades started going down. Like couldn't pay attention to anything. And they're like, what's wrong with you? You're dumb. I'm like drooling in class pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah. That's Kentucky high school. What do you expect?
I don't picture it being much different than Missouri high school, to be honest with you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we're about in the same boat.
Yeah. Everyone's competing for the, worst in the country at that point.
The flyover states.
Exactly. So, but I guess kind of getting from, looking at your injury background and, everything that you've done, you've gotten into PRI and some of these other, types of systems. And I'm assuming you probably got into those because of injuries that you had.
I think there's definitely a bias there for sure.
Definitely. I'm the same way. That's how I really got into those. That's why I went, the rehab route. And I ended up going through my physical therapist assistant. I was like, I'm still hurting. I can't train the way I want to. What the hell do I do? Seen a bunch of PTs and it's like, I'm going to figure out my damn self.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, kind of having this experience, what is your take on some of these systems nowadays? I know that's a broad question, but how do you still utilize them or if you do at all?
I mean, I have had, I think the advantage of, because I've been in the industry so long, I've taken just about all of them to some extent, some much deeper than others, right? Where, when I first got into training, going back to my, I got my CSCS and started training, like I immediately, my wife and I moved to New York for her work immediately. So it's like, I had all this like athletic background, and now I had a athletic specific certification and education base. And I was working in the middle of Manhattan in a box gym. Right. So it's like I had nobody to use any of this stuff on. So almost immediately I had to look into different education models and, to find something that kind of suited more the people that I was working with. I dove into like FMS first. That was like the big one, back then. We're talking at this point, like 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. And I went through and I did the FMS and over the years, it's funny because I've actually probably done 10 different FMS like live seminars, because even as a manager, I would take groups of coaches to them, through that process. So I did that one quite deeply. I taught the FMS through our employee onboarding aspect for New York. So I worked with every new coach every month that was hired and taught them the FMS and the OPT model of NASM. So I'm the overhead squat assessment and all those things. So to age myself a little bit, I went through all of that stuff. And so I learned that, fairly deeply. And then that obviously led to me wanting to divest time into other models as well. So I went into, DNS first, because it was almost the complete opposite. I kind of thought, well, it's like, okay, I know I've got a pretty good handle of this very structured system. And now I kind of want to understand what the other side is. And DNS was becoming a little more popular. And all of a sudden I'm rolling around and crawling and doing all these other things. And, so I took a few courses with that and found a little bit of utility with that with some of the clients I was working with. And that led me into FRC and FRA. And I ended up taking a few courses, a few seminars within that and kind of learning their system to the extent of which it was practical, with the people I worked with. And then that led me into PRI and IKN actually at the time as well. And I took a few of those courses and took my primaries first. At that point, I had just started working at Peak, and Pat Davidson was our education director. And he was basically like, hey, take this stuff. And I was like, cool. So I took all the primaries basically within a month span and just crammed them and did all at home work. Never got to schedule an in person for any of those. And had the advantage of, being able to, I think Pat was a huge influence with this. Like I was learning it and kind of in the same process. Like we were training, we were on the floor and we were working through programs. He was beta testing Mass and, Mass 1 at that point, and we were kind of working through it and working on some prep work and some other things and utility for this stuff. And, so I had the application process, almost immediately with that, which I think, had I gone to a live seminar for any of those, I might not have had, and I didn't really realize that until I went to my first live course, which was I&I, and kind of walked in and, it was felt like I was the only person there who trained basically. Like I walked in and I was just like, oh, like, I've like a lot of khakis and polos, and
I know exactly
cool.
how you.
And again, there's nothing. Contrary to popular belief, I have nothing against that. But I was the only, like, everybody there was pretty much a DPT or a chiro, right? And I'm just like a trainer. At that point, I was a training manager, but I'm just a trainer, right? And so I'm talking with them about like ways that you would, kind of use these principles on a training floor, right? And not just in the assessment, itself, but actually looking at like progressive models and ways to kind of overload some of these things. And people kind of looked at me like I had three heads, and I was just like, oh shit, like, okay, like my mind's always going to go to training and it's always going to go to stimulus, right? So that was kind of my first indicator that like what we were doing, at Peak, with Pat and some of the other guys. We also had the resilient team and some of those guys that was different than a lot of what was being even taught through the courses. And I took a few more courses, over the next years. And then at that point kind of just got to where it's like, okay, like I've kind of run to the end of applicability for me, right? Like I didn't care that much about things going on above the neck level. Like I'm not, like at that point I was like, I'm not taking, if it's above the head, I'm going to refer out, at this point for me. And that's just my beliefs, again, not saying anything about anybody else's. But it's like, for me, it's like, I'm a trainer. Like I have no personal interest in rehabbing people. I didn't go to school to be a DPT. I like to work on a progressive model. So I'm always going to try to take these systems and use them within that realm. And my goal is to always get clients training as quickly as possible and to use the interventions that are going to get them there the fastest. And, so now when I look at this within my own training process, I still use a lot of the concepts, but I use them within kind of I work within a concurrent system. So I use them within like my secondary and tertiary, exercise selections, right? So if I'm looking at like a primary exercise selection, like those are kind of my big bilateral force production based lifts, right? So those are going to be your trap bar deadlifts and your squats and what have you, upper body. And for those, it's like I'm gonna use the modalities and the strategies that are going to allow me to produce the most force, right? Because that's the goal of that exercise is output. And when I get into secondary models, like that's where I'm going to get into things that are maybe more focused on movement competency, mechanical tension, hypertrophy, getting in some volume, building work capacity, from that perspective, building occlusion rates. And that's where sometimes I'll use things like, stance related split squat variations or something of that nature, right? Depending on who I'm working with and what their goals are. But I'm still going to use variations that allow me to load, right? So that front foot elevated, split squat where I am trying to get into like mid propulsion, right? I'm probably going to use a Hatfield variation so I could load the shit out of it rather than a few, pink dumbbells by my side, right? Like sure. I'm going to find a way to add constraints and add stimulus and add load to this variation. Same thing with like a single leg RDL where I want to work on, hip lock on the top end. So I want to work on internally rotating on the eccentric and then concentrically externally rotating and getting into full extension. Like I've been playing around with like that landmine version that I've been posting lately, because the force vector literally pushes you into it and then you have to push yourself out of it. Right. And that's a way for me to build in constraints that kind of force the patterning and then the biomechanic, aspects that I want to happen under load. Right. And it's a very controlled environment for me to do that. And basically when I get into my tertiary variations, now I'm looking at things that are going to be more stability based, right? So I'm removing more constraints, I'm decreasing intensity, and I'm working on things that are probably even more movement competency driven. But I'm working on it to, where there is more of a vestibular aspect, there is more of a spatial aspect, there's less constraints. I do have to stabilize myself a little bit more, and I have to control things a little bit more. So it is going to be a little more neuromuscularly driven from that perspective. And I'll actually usually use those as my prep work, right? Where again, it's like that might be something where I can just drive that sensory awareness for a few rounds before I get into my primaries, and then I get into my secondaries on like what an average strength session might look like.
Gotcha.
That was a lot. That was a jumble of.
No, I mean, I loved every second of it. Obviously, I think very similar, especially after taking the compound performance mentorship. So I am a bit biased. So I'm like, okay, that makes complete sense to me. But one thing I do have a question of, and, I think I talk up a lot about, and, taking like Alex Effer's course and all of that, like going from these conscious based, you're having to think nonstop about what muscles are working, the stability aspect, all of this, and then getting to this point where things are unconscious and you're just gripping and ripping, right, to some degree, or you're playing a sport and, you're just having these things sort of that you've been working on, hopefully in the gym, and they display themselves on the court or the field. Yep. And I'm curious, what you utilize, if that's sort of your progression through a workout and you see positive changes, if there's testing that you utilize to see that carry over. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I do think, one of the things that one of my goals with training and is I do want to differentiate, training from sport, and there's going to be things that we train that will resemble, actions of sport, because we are going to work through some patterning. But again, there's much less variability within the actual training as there is within the sport, right? Like we know that working on a Hatfield squat doesn't necessarily look like a vertical leap in basketball, right? Like there's no pendulum step. It's not the same thing, but we can work on the ability to produce force. We can work on tissue quality. We can work on some ranges of motion that might be useful from that perspective. And kind of the same thing as we're looking at some of these more like stance driven, split squat models or whatever we want to call them, where these things are, for me, they're going to be much more exploratory, and they are going to be, essentially giving me exposures to different ranges of motion and different integrations, right? Like I know that if I can rotate my pelvis a little bit, I'm going to get more adductor magnus for stabilization and within that front leg. And if I rotate it the other way, I'm going to get more glute med. And maybe if I'm in AIC, that matters. If I want to do one on one leg or the other, maybe if I'm not, I just practice both, right? Or maybe I just work on moving. And same thing, like a lateral lunge might prepare tissues for a defensive slide or a cut or a change of direction, but it's not the same thing, right? Like we know that, again, we're not going to be absorbing or dispersing force at the rate of what a basketball player or a soccer player is trying to do when they cut the sprint, right, and change direction. We just want to be able to give exposures to those ranges, So when I look at strength training, I do want to do things that will stress the tissues and the systems to an extent to what somebody's going to be encompassing during their sport. But at the end of the day, like they're going to pick up most of their exposures within the sport itself, right? So if I'm looking at that, it's like, one, I want to be able to watch them play, and I want to make sure that I'm training the right things, right? I want to understand what their rate limiters actually are, right? Like if I've got somebody who has a rate limit, like they have a hard time moving laterally on a basketball court, well, that could be a lot of different things, right? That could be biomechanically they don't have access to a range of motion they need, right? They can't drive enough internal rotation to drive external rotation and push, right? That might be they're just not strong, so they're slow, and it's a force production based issue, right? That might be they don't have good capacity, so they just slow down as they fatigue, right? Or they occlude, their glute med and their QL cramp up, right? And their TFL cramps up as they're trying to go through these ranges. That might be they have a hard time actually yielding and absorbing force to disperse, right? So they need more eccentric orientation of those tissues, and they need to be able to handle those things ballistically, right? For stretch reflex and stretch shortening cycles, right? That might be again that they have a hard time pushing off, right, and producing power, right? So if I'm watching that process, and I have to identify like where that person is actually limited, right? Because there's a lot of different ways that I can train a lateral shift or lateral movement, right? That might be actual laterally hip shifting and just exploring ranges of motion and getting stable within those. Could be isometrics into those positions just to give somebody exposure into them. Could be a kettlebell hip shift, right? Where they have to absorb force and push back. Could be a heavily loaded lateral sled drag, right? Where they really have to push against the ground and produce force through full. I don't know, right? But I want to make sure that if I am applying some kind of intervention to that athlete, that I'm addressing the right thing. So the test is often for me, it's like watching them play their sport if possible. And two, like watching them facilitate these movements. And that's where even like my assessment process is very specific to the individual in front of me's actual task demands. I don't necessarily have a set assessment, but I have categories which I can pull things through, right? And be more specific to that. And then as I'm testing it over time, I'm looking at training numbers. And then subjectively, I'm also talking with the individual about, their confidence in these movements and how they feel about them, do they feel prepared, et cetera, right? So there's definitely, it's a broad question, and that's probably not a super detailed answer, from that perspective. But at the end of the day, for me, it's like I need to understand, what I'm actually going to be training to provide the right interventions. And I think rather than going by an algorithm, that a system teaches, like that may or may not be specific to what that athlete's actual limitation is. I need to actually make sure that I'm watching them do the thing they're trying to do and perform the task that they're trying to perform.
I think there's merit to so for your example, like a lateral movement, or like, what if you just make them lateral shuffle more? What if you just make them do that more? Like, I think, especially when you've gone down the rabbit hole of whatever systems or models that you're looking at, you kind of forget like, well, hey, just make them do it more and just see if there's a competency aspect. Because again, going off of what you're saying is like, they're going to learn more from the sport itself. So just make them do that.
Oh yeah.
And see where it gets you, and then go, that should be like step one almost.
Yeah. And it's like I was, my 8-year-old had 3 basketball games this weekend, and none of them laterally shuffle in a game. They just sprint beside the ball handler everywhere they go. Right. So it's like, if I'm working with like a 10, 11, 12-year-old who's having trouble with this movement, like there's a good chance they're just not good at it. And it's a skill acquisition issue, like you just said. If I'm working with a 27-year-old, pro player in Europe, then I might be dealing with something else because I know they've had the exposures, right? And that's even where, like within my own training, like I will throw a lot of these little things into like extensive based warm-ups on my conditioning days as well, where it's like, if I want to train the ankle complex in the foot, right? And again, give it exposures to different force angles, different vector angles, et cetera. Like one of the warm-ups that I do myself that I give a lot of my clients, whether they're gen pop or athletic populations, is, we'll get barefoot and I'll have them, skip, backward shuffle, lateral shuffle, lateral shuffle. And just 5 minutes continuous at a slow pace and trying to stay pretty bouncy off the ground. Right. And through that, it's like they're having to manage their center of mass in a lot of different ways, right? Between the forwards and the backwards. And then laterally, like we're going through pronation, supination cycles. Like we're getting tibial rotation, we're getting push off, we're getting some glute med in there. So like little stuff like that, I think is incredibly valuable within that. And for me, like, I never look at a singular training day alone in a vacuum. And I think that's what social media has. I think that's where social media kind of defines people poorly a lot of the time, right? Is we'll see like a workout and you're like, oh, well, that person only strength trains, or that person doesn't do this or doesn't believe in this. And it's like, no, man, that person just had a minute to cram in a bunch of shit, right? Like you don't know what they do, outside of that. Like you're looking at one training day out of one training week, out of one block over the course of a mesocycle, right? And over the course of a macro cycle. And it's like, that doesn't tell us a full story at all. That's like picking up a book and just reading a random page and trying to figure out what it's about, and I think that's hard is because people don't have those, they don't have those conversations, right? Like I went through, the last 2 or 3 years, a bunch of people like saying like, I don't believe in this system anymore. I don't understand this system. I don't use this system. It's like, man, I use it all the time. It's like, I just don't use it the same way you do because I don't work with your clients and my clients have different training goals and I prefer different applications. Right. And I think that's one of the hard things is, again, the application of these systems is always going to be more important than the information provided. Like we can all take the same 3-day seminar. You're going to be in that room. Like we just talked about, like my experience, like I went in a room with probably 50 other people and every single person in there's got a different application process based on who they're working with, what those people, again, prefer, what their perception of their treatment is, and then what their actual task demands and goal selections are. And, for me, like I don't work in the rehab realm. Like I don't like when somebody comes to me with an injury, I refer them out. Like I don't try to be that person. And I don't even want to be that person because I think that training is incredibly boring. Like I don't like it, so it's like, that's my bias. Right. So when I'm using these things, like I'm trying to find a way to utilize these positions and orientations and, concepts like AFIR and some of these things to drive more outputs. Like I never want to use them as regression models. Like I'm always trying to use them as regression model or as progression models. And I think that's where a lot of people get, I don't want to say confused, but they don't recognize what I'm trying to do. And I'm honestly like, I don't really explain it that well because if you see it, you see it. If you don't, you don't. And that's just like, I don't care enough to have conversations about it anymore on Instagram. Like I'm happy talking with you about it, but like talking in the threads or DMs about this shit is just too much now.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. And, it's a gray that you have to live in, and it's tough. There's not a name for it either. I think that if there was a sort of name, we can't call it like functional training anymore because that's been demonized and it's terrible. Oh, yeah. And like, there's no word to describe, what it is, the gray that this all is. It's just, I guess, progression and some regressions of training.
Yeah. And I think that's
training.
What I found. Yeah. It's training. Like we're lifting weights, and I think that's what's hard for me because I'll have conversations with people and they like truly believe that like, I'll say the acronym that like that PRI invented the gait cycle. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like,
right.
Like I can show you like gait cycle references from 70 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, like it's like, they're like, oh, you're doing PRI exercises. I'm like, a split squat?
Yeah. It's been around for a while.
I've seen Arnold do split squat. Was Arnie a PRI guy back in the day? Like I had no idea doing a front foot elevated split squat. It's like, these are exercises, right? And there's varying levels of nuance to them. But it's like the thing that has always bothered me about these systems is like we're hyper focused on trying to force ranges of motion or joint actions that should just happen naturally, right? Like when you go into hip flexion, you will have an action of internal rotation at the femur. Like I learned that in NASM, right? I learned that in FMS. I learned that in FRC. Like that's not just a PRI thing, right? Like they all teach this stuff. We're just looking at different application models, from that perspective. And everybody acts like their system owns these joint models. And it's like, no, like undergrad anatomy and physiology will tell you this. Like it's not this isn't new stuff. This is just somebody's spin on the thing. Right. And I think that's where, for me, it's like it's hard to like perform certain exercises without somebody, attuning it to a system when it's not a system. It's just movement. It's just like you said, it's just lifting weights. Like if I look at most of the machines in my Planet Fitness, like they're biomechanically suitable to a lot of these models. Like I look at a chest press it's got an elevated foot spot. It's literally, um, a chest press with pronation, right? From that perspective. And I'm just like, this is all, it's just the human body, right? And we're looking at it through these different lenses from these different systems. And it's like, most people should just focus on, at that point, stimulus outputs and kind of look at it from that perspective, where it's just like, you're worried so much about the acronyms and the applications and the minutia that you're not applying any stimulus to your clients. Like they're not going to get better on a lot of these things. And I think like the novelty will maybe provide something short term for them, but long term, you're going to get no tissue adaptation because you're not stressing them enough, And I think that's where, I don't want to say the industry, but like this little corner of the ecosystem or industry, or that quote unquote corrective exercise movement. And it's not just PRI; it is all of these systems. Like a glute bridge from FMS is only going to get you so far too, right? Where they all kind of like, they fail athletes who are actually going to go on a court and have to produce force and manage force over time. And that's not moving people forward in my experience.
100%. Well, I always tell people, I'm like, would you rather have perfect mobility and posture for the rest of your life, or would you rather have the muscular endurance, the strength, the hypertrophy for the rest of your life? Like what's going to make you live longer, probably. And they're like, oh, let me think about it. And of course, a couple people say posture. I'm like, wrong. Like, right. Yeah. We need to talk a little bit right now, but, it's just in working in hospital and rehab settings and just seeing, especially as we age and sarcopenia, losing muscle mass, it's like, why am I going to give someone 3 months of this 90-90 hip lift when they probably need to just do some training, get some tissue adaptations, and that's going to carry them over way longer? I can get them into a fitness program. I can do all these good things, and that might literally add some years to their life potentially.
Well, and that's where, like, even looking at posture, I've enjoyed a lot of your posts on this as well, where it's just like postural issues or compensatory postural strategies, whatever we want to call them, like in my experience, like are almost always a strength or capacity based issue, right? Like whether that's, again, like a movement strategy under load, right? Or whether that's a movement strategy just trying to deal with, gravity, from that perspective, or your own body weight, right? It's like, we know at this point, like anybody who's like significantly overweight, it's going to be a wide ISA with posterior compression, literally because their belly is dragging them forward in space, right? So if I'm a coach at that point and I can lay that person on the ground and have them do all the 90-90s with reaches and the bear position stuff and the sideline stuff that I want to try to, again, get a different, thorax orientation or whatever. But if we don't lose the weight, they're like, they stand up and they're right back where they were. Right. So it's like at that point, it's like, okay, well, I've got somebody who's overweight. So that's dictating what their posture and their structural interventions are from a strategy perspective. And two, they're also at risk of metabolic disease and high blood pressure and many other cardiovascular based issues. Right. So at that point, it's like, just help them lose the weight.
Look at the bigger picture.
Like literally just look at the bigger picture and help them lose, like put your balloons back in your pocket and help them lose the weight, right? Give them better strategies. And it's stuff like that it drives me crazy about this industry, because we're so obsessed with, I don't know if it's like showing value. Like nobody wants to be a personal trainer. They don't want to be a coach. Everybody's like a posture specialist or a movement specialist or biomechanics specialist or a performance-based coach or whatever. we're personal trainers. Like most of us took weekend, like 3-day certs, and paid a couple $100, right? And sure, there might be an undergrad in there, whatever, but it's like, help the person lose the weight and get stronger. And it'll probably like fix itself over time. And you've done a lot more good, right? You've done the low hanging fruit. You're getting a bigger return. You hit the bigger rocks, etc. And I think that's where, we focus on the most complex strategies sometimes because we're so interested and invested in this industry. And it's like our clients need the simple shit. Like it's for the most part, again, especially if you're working with general population, like you're working with people who just don't move. Like they just need to move. It's like you were talking about with the defensive slides. Like they don't move well because they never fucking move.
Yeah, 100%.
Like get them to move. And I think that's where, they're not competent, supporting their own bodies in space, whether that's because of their body mass or because they're just not strong enough to support their bodies. Like get them moving, get them used to that, give them like stress them at an appropriate level. And I think that's just, it's almost too simple for a lot of the industry, unfortunately.
Oh, 100%. Like it always cracks me up, especially you use a breathing strategy, that 90-90 hip lift. It's like, oh, we got to change. Cool. But it doesn't, quote unquote, stick. And it's like, oh, you need glasses. Oh, you need to go get a splint. It's like, dude, why don't you just like, maybe they're not strong enough to literally stay there. And that like new change that you got, like the tissue is just not able to adapt to it. Why don't you just train it? It just,
I knew I needed to shift my own content when I would get DMs and people would be like, hey, I've been doing this for, 3 years. I've got glasses. I've got, dental splints. I've got elevations in my shoes and special insoles. And I'm like, so you've done all these things. You've been doing it for 3 years and they still don't work. And you want me to try to provide you with more of this stuff. Like say that out loud. Like how much have you strength trained? How much like actual like hard aerobic work have you done? Not breathing drills, but actually like challenging aerobic work, zone 3 and 4 work. Build up your actual aerobic system. Build up your capacity. Maybe you'll breathe better. Right? And it's just like these are the things that it's just like for me, all of those things are just band-aids, right? Like it's a human, like that person has a body. They might have asymmetries. We all have asymmetries. Like that's well established. Like we don't need to go into that. Like everybody's asymmetrical to the extent that they're asymmetrical. Again, is probably just they've been compensating through strategies for their entire lives instead of getting stronger, right? And they're just rotated, whatever. I think that's just something where it's like let's use strength training interventions to rotate them back and get them in, into better alignment or whatever, a better position to exert force. And I think that's just where it's like all those things are these passive interventions, and they might work if somebody's coming out of a rehab base and they're again, they're starting below baseline of their normal physical capabilities. But it's like we're trying to apply rehab strategies to an otherwise healthy population. And that's a regression model. And that's shitty. In my opinion, like I just like it just
that's shitty.
And again, it's like it's funny. It's like because I have nothing against PRI, and I don't blame PRI for this. Like PRI has restoration in their name.
Mm-hmm.
It's very clearly a rehab model. So why are we using it on uninjured people? Like that's problematic for me, just from a foundational perspective. And if you work in rehab and you want to use it, that's great. But if you're a trainer at Equinox working with otherwise healthy individuals that want to work on body composition and get stronger, there's probably better routes for a lot of this stuff. It doesn't mean you can't look at these movements through a biomechanical lens, right? Like you can have somebody do alternating reciprocal exercises or stance related single leg work or whatever, but you can do it under load. Like you can give them constraints and load them. You can work it within a strength-based, application. And I think that's what we're missing a lot of the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm curious about, so I talked to Joel Smith last week, and one of the things he was talking about is using some of these weightlifting strategies. And I'm sure, if I had him on the call right now, we'd have a good discussion, and he doesn't think this like 100%, but he talked about, deepening compensation wells, as he said. So I'm imagining he's probably talking about, you got a collegiate athlete that's like, I'm going to go get strong, so I'll be better at my sport, does a bunch of back squats, gets strong, but then he slows himself down or potentially creates more compensation. I was curious, would you agree with that? Or what's something that, do you utilize some of these, I guess, biomechanical models to prevent that from happening?
Yeah. And I think that's where like Joel and I like probably agree on, and we've talked about this as well, is because I'm that basketball player who got really strong,
Yeah.
but like moved worse. Right. And again, there were injuries on top of that too, but there was a pretty direct correlation with me like getting stronger and like having a worse vertical at that point in my life, and I think that's where, again, like we have to understand that different tasks require different strategies to be successful. And we have to respect that. And a training strategy that benefits a strength-based athlete is, obviously probably not going to be completely correct with a capacity-based athlete or an elastic-based athlete, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like those are two different training tasks, and the training should look different from that perspective. And, so I think for me, it's like, that's not saying back squats are bad. That's just saying that's a misapplication of a tool by a coach. Like that's not a coach looking at the athlete and what they're actually trying to do on a basketball court or volleyball court or track field or whatever. That's just looking at them and saying, "Oh, we're going to back squat because my university invested $2 million in this huge weight room, and we've got 20 racks. I got to fill them up. And I think that's where, if somebody does have a clear strength limitation, cool, we'll get them stronger. But if that's not their limitation, increasing their strength isn't necessarily going to have the return on investment from a training perspective that you hope it does, right? Like, and that again, like my assessment process always begins with understanding the task demands first. Like if I'm working with a runner, or I'm working with a soccer player, or I'm working with a strength-based athlete of some sort, I have to understand what their sport demands. And if I'm working with a gen pop, I have to understand what their lifestyle demands, right? Same thing, just task, right? And at that point, like I can understand the physical and physiological qualities along with the psychological and cognitive tactical qualities that are going to be required by that sport. And then I can look at them and their abilities respective to those things, right? And I might have a basketball player who isn't strong enough. Like they might be a 180-pound power forward who gets boxed out of bounds every time a shot goes up and can't stay on a spot and whatever. And that guy may have a 44-inch vertical and be super elastic, but it doesn't matter if he can't ever get off the ground. Okay, that might be somebody who needs to squat a little bit. That might be a big area of opportunity for that athlete. Like they just might not be strong enough. They might not be heavy enough. They might need better tissue quality from that perspective. They might need to be able to resist force better.
Yeah.
Right. I might look at another athlete who is incredibly strong, but they're slow. They can't get off the ground, and that's their limitation. And that person, like, no amount of strength training is going to get them better at that. They need to run and jump. They need to become more elastic. They need to get better at those skills, right? And again, I might have somebody else who just gets winded after 2 minutes of playing, and they just have poor capacity. Mm-hmm. And that's somebody I need to work aerobic threshold work. And because they're breaking down because they're always fatigued, and that's something that I need to work on for that athlete. And for those three athletes, like they all have performance issues, but they all have performance issues for very different reasons, and they're all going to have very different training strategies based on that. And I think that's where, for me, none of these things is good or bad. Like working on plyometric work, that's not bad, but it's not great for everybody. Someone who already jumps really well but has a different limitation, you're just doing what they're already good at. That's not necessarily going to get them better at something else. Same thing with an athlete who's incredibly strong but can't move laterally, right? Or has a hard time with just any general locomotion, right? Or coordination aspects of things. Like, yeah, increasing their back squat 100 pounds is cool, but did you make them a better player, right? So it's like, those are things for me where, like, I think Joel and I would agree on that aspect, where it's like, most of what I see in the training process is just misapplication. Like when things go wrong, it's not because X exercise is a bad exercise for basketball players. It just wasn't the right exercise for that basketball player. And it's hard for coaches to separate that thought process because it's much easier to just, again, try to find an enemy or alienate an inanimate object from that perspective, and it's just like,
Is
we
that
have to
just
think deeper
like,
than that.
yeah, is that just human nature, or would you blame that on social media like this?
I think it's human nature, man. Like humans do very poorly at qualifying things they don't understand. And again, like if we wanted to go like into like sociology or anthropology, like we could go into like religion and everything else with this. And like, when we can't explain things, we're like, oh, well, such and such up in the sky, like made it happen. Right. Like that's what it turns into. We tell a story about it. Right. And sometimes the easiest story to tell is that back squats are bad for you.
Yeah, good and evil.
Yeah, it's like comes back to like these basic foundational human nature based things, and it's just like social media. I don't think has made anything in the industry worse. I think it's amplified a lot of people's opinions. It's like as someone who worked in gyms long before social media and like smartphones, right? I remember getting my first iPhone like 4 years into my career. You saw all the same stupid stuff in a gym setting. It's just nobody else did. Like every gym staff had their 5x5 guy, their Bosu guy, their mobility specialist, their yogi Pilates chick, right? I hate to classify, but they were usually girls. And it's just like everybody had their corrective exercise specialist. I was that person for a long time, right? Where I would get all the hurt people and I hated my job, but I was very busy, and it's just like, everybody had their bodybuilder. It's like you saw the same archetypes in every gym that you went into and every staff that you saw. But it's like that they were these own little like micro environments. There was no global social media where it's like you could, see what people were doing half a world away. Like I spent the morning getting trolled by some dude in India who doesn't even follow me. It just like, what the fuck, man? Like it just like
social media tribes is what
like literally trying to challenge me to a live debate. I was like, I don't have time for that. I don't even know who you are. You don't even know what you want to debate on. You just want to get on and argue with me for no reason. Like, no, I'm good. It's the weirdest thing. And it's like social media just amplified that aspect of things where it's like, now you just see that it's everywhere. And you see that you have all these hundreds to thousands of people that agree with you. So it strengthens your own bias, within that too. That it's just made tribes larger, from that respect. It hasn't necessarily, I think, made new tribes. The tribes themselves just got much larger and more powerful.
Yeah, I agree with that. Do you get hyped up when people come at you on social media, or are you like pretty jaded now?
At this point, I did. I mean, it depends on it. I want to be clear because it's like there's plenty of people who disagree with me that I can have really good conversations with, and that I have a lot of respect for. And like because that for me, it's like I'm very aware that I do things differently than people, but I'm also very aware that my way of doing things isn't the only way of doing things. Right? It works for me and the people that I work with, and I enjoy doing it. And I think that's where, again, like the amount of people over the last few years who have been viscerally upset just by me doing something different is actually crazy to me. And it's just like, this is my business working with my clients and posting on my page. Like,
yeah,
what's going on?
Why are you personally offended?
Yeah. Why are you personally offended by that? So it's a strange thing. But most people I can have a pretty decent conversation with, and we can respectively just disagree based on our own context and still be friends and still have a very amicable relationship, and but if somebody's coming at me just to like troll, like I just block them now. I don't even talk to them. Like it's not at that point, it's not worth my time and it's not worth my energy because it does like I do get upset about it. I'll definitely admit that like it's something that bothers me and it'll just stick with me, for the entire
Just,
day. I'm like,
yeah, you can't shake it. It's
yeah,
like,
I'm just like such and such, from Pennsylvania thinks I'm an idiot, and it's
it's
just like I'll
toxic,
never meet this person, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
it's so at this point I just like I'll just block people. I'm just like, it's not worth the conversation if you're coming at me with ad hominems and things of that nature. Like we're already starting off on the bad foot. If you're asking questions and we're talking back and forth,
Mhm.
I'm perfectly happy to not agree with everybody as long as everybody's respectful within that process.
Exactly. The respect part is huge. I've had plenty of people who are maybe respected in the industry, but they come at me with names and I'm like, all right, like I'm not going to give you any of my time. Like what
It's
was the point of that?
wild
Yeah.
over a difference in opinion, right? Because again, it's like all of
Granted,
this stuff works
yeah,
to,
true.
it's just like with a good practitioner, a good coach, it all works because the biggest thing in any of these systems working is honestly client buy-in.
Hmm.
If the client believes you know what you're talking about and they will do whatever drill, whatever it is, whatever system it is with a high level intention, they'll probably get better over time.
Oh yeah.
It's just like they'll make improvements, and I think there's a lot of self-efficacy and self-determination theory kind of built into that process as well from a client facing side. But it's just like most of the people, because it's like when we talk about like all these different diets that work, but they all just put you in a calorie deficit. It's like all these training interventions work because they get you training.
Yeah. You get stronger.
You you got stronger. Cool,
Weird.
man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
it's like you learned how to like manage force and gravity better. Surprise, surprise, right? We can call that a
mhm.
ZOA or inter-abdominal pressure or some postural intervention or diaphragmatic, whatever. It's just like you got stronger.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do you think
cool.
there's something to, even because they'd say, in the past 100 years, like male testosterone has decreased over time. Do you think that is like potentially more of like just a movement based thing to some degree? Like we just move less?
I mean, it definitely could be. And again, like that's definitely not my area of expertise. I think
Yeah.
if we look at autonomics and we look at movement and the kind of the combined aspect, and this is something like one of my favorite books ever is Sapiens by Harari. And he talks about kind of the de-evolution of the human species through hunter-gatherers to agricultural, revolution, through the industrial revolution, through the technological revolution. And basically from the agricultural revolution on, we became a more sedentary population, right? And even looking at the hunter gatherer to the agricultural, that was when again we became more geographically stable, right? We moved around less globally, right? Because now we had farms, we had industry, we had even economic systems that kind of sprouted up within these little tribes. And obviously now we get into industrial and now we have machines doing our work for us and we're just managing those things and we're doing less overall work. And then we get into technological and now we're doing even less overall work because we have access to things like the internet and social media and worldwide news and all this stuff. And I
Even
do
mental capacity work.
yeah, right. I think there's a lot to be said of the human species right now, just as a whole, being highly, highly stimulated with information, inundated with information at all times, but not getting enough physical activity to go along with that, right? And I think as organisms, like most other animals, right? Like when you look at any other animal, like when you look at like Sapolsky's, like why zebras don't get ulcers, right? Stimulation precedes action, right? So psychological cognitive stimulation precedes physical or physiological exertion, at almost every level, right? And that's what our sympathetic nervous system is. It's fight or flight, right? Like it's the spurn movement, right? Not sitting there and scrolling on your phone and getting
Mhm.
mad at somebody half a world away. And I do think there is a lot of stress and stimulus load with very little exertion. And I think that's the combination that's probably the worst for us, right? Is we don't move a lot. That's very true. But we're also overly stimulated at all times. So we're hypersympathetic, but we're getting no outlet from a physical or physiological perspective. And for me, that's like a systemic mismatch, right? If
Yeah.
we look at autonomics, we look at physiology and biology. And I think that's where, a lot of this stuff, like you called it toxic, and it is, I think it, like and again, this is, I think it's Sapolskyism, but this might be from Behave, but it's like the human brain isn't isn't made or isn't meant to know what's going on thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's really not meant to know what's going on outside of our own vision in a lot of ways. Right. Like it's a prediction based model where it's like we're supposed to be able to really kind of manage our own environments extremely well, and the variables and the other players within our environments. But us understanding that there are wars and famine and things happening in other countries across oceans, let alone in other states and other cities, right? Like there's not much, like that's just stressing our system with no outlet, like things that we can't do anything about from that perspective that we're getting stressed about all the time. And I think that's like social media has layered another aspect onto that too, because now you can interact with those people, but you can't come to solutions oftentimes, right? And again, this is way off the training sphere, but it's definitely something that I think I think about stuff like this all the time, where it's just like I look at my dog fucking sleeping on the couch right there, and he knows like when he's gonna get fed and played with and walked. I'm just like, man, like that's sometimes I'm just like, man, if we could switch places for a day, I'd probably be much happier.
Yeah, no. Well, and I'd like to add to that aspect too, thinking about other places, all these global events, but I would even add with our own training, thinking about the name of the muscle that you're activating, the joint actions associated with that. If you're in a right alignment, like your body's not supposed to think about that like at all.
It's conscious incompetence is a dangerous place to be.
Right.
Honestly. Like, and conscious competence, like you said earlier, that like that's not the answer. Like if you're going through your training session and you're having to think, okay, I need to adduct my femur at about 15 degrees and really try to drop into my hip capsule and drive rotation as I'm going through the eccentric action or early propulsion to mid propulsion of this front foot elevated split squat. I need to rotate my rib cage the other way, another 15 degrees. And I need to exhale my way up to close down that left oblique. It's a shitty exercise.
Yeah, 100%.
It's not going to carry over to much. Right. Again, like you can work through some movement stuff and you're going to feel a nice little burn in your right glute and adductor potentially. But at the same time, it's like, are you going to be one of those people that's like trying to walk and thinking about like squeezing their glutes at late toe off?
Right. Like just let it happen. I have to remind that all the time. Yeah. They're like, well, I didn't feel this muscle. It's like, it's okay. You did it. You even took a video of yourself and it was, you were stacked, you were whatever. Yeah. It looks good. You didn't
fall over. It did. Something happened. Something happened. Yeah.
Exactly. Like do this for a month and then let's talk. And let's see if there's an adaptation. Like don't worry about it. But, all right, man. I know we're getting a little close on time here. I do have one more question for you, especially as someone who's been in the industry. I think realizing the industry is still pretty dang young and it's still the Wild West to some degree. But what is something like, what's your biggest prediction in the next like 10, 20 years? What do you think is going to happen? Gosh. Like, where are we going?
No, I can barely stay a year ahead.
Going against what Sapolsky said, you think about this.
No, I do think, I think one of the good things, because again, I don't even think social media is all bad, contrary to what I kind of just said, because I think in general, the average person is more aware of fitness culture. Like it's like, I think when you're now talking to your everyday general population person, they have a better understanding of why exercise is important than
you can't
maybe
wear yoga pants.
Social media.
Yeah, you can't wear yoga pants and not know about exercise.
Yeah, right. Like, and again, like maybe it's too much information. Like, should you, if you're like a stay-at-home mom of three that has no general knowledge of fitness, except you go to a couple like Orange Theory classes a week, but you're trying to watch your HRV 7 days a week, is that necessarily a good thing? Like, maybe not. But I do think that just in general, people have a better understanding of not necessarily health, but why health is important. And those are two different things. So I do think there's going to be, because of that, more curiosity from your average person. So I actually do expect, I think the fitness industry as a whole will grow. And again, it's always hard for me because, it's even like talking about these systems, right? Like when you're in the industry, like you think PRI is this huge thing that everybody knows about. And then you realize this is like 0.5% of 1% of like what, like it's a very small, secluded little corner, right? And you think it's important because that's your tribe and you've got a couple, thousand people who support what you say. But the reality of it is, people are doing things all over the place that have never heard of the acronym, have no idea what a diaphragm is, or even where Nebraska is on a map, from that perspective, right? And it's just like these things can be right and they can be important, but they're not necessary for a lot of people to just get in better shape and to get healthier overall. So I do think, just the industry will continue to expand. I think, again, with a lot of the other things that we're seeing at a political level related to health and insurance and like the hospital system and even the pharmaceutical system to an extent, I think you will see a more preventative, proactive thought process geared towards health just by your everyday consumer as well, because it will probably end up being more affordable, uh, potentially, than retroactively trying to address things
Right.
down the road. Like I think it's still overall it's good. Like I'm fully aware that like a lot of the things that I see on a daily basis that or arguments I get in or whatever, the conflict that I find myself in, none of it matters, in the grand scheme of things. And that's, for me, like it's humbling, but it's also like very gratifying to know that it's like, okay, like a lot of these things that I think matter, I get upset about or whatever. It's literally only because I'm one of these people who is invested in the minutia, and other people are just invested in other details of things. But most of the people out there, like I go to a gym every morning where it's like they have classes and they're filled with 20 people, five, six, seven, eight, and they don't talk about any of this shit. And those people are in great shape.
Yeah.
And it's like that for me is actually like something that I really enjoy, where I'm just like watching people like move and do shit and exercise. They're not thinking about anything except getting through it.
They're just having fun
They're
or
just having
yeah.
a good time. Like they're
Yeah.
getting challenged in a positive way, and they're having fun. Um, and it's like that for me is much more gratifying than like going to a personal training studio where everybody's on the ground doing these really technical movements.
Yeah. That was one thing talking to Joel, him establishing his warm-ups, doing games and even talking to
Oh
Jake
yeah.
Tura. Have you found anything, my last question, my promise. Have you found anything useful in remote training to like promote a game as a warm-up?
So it's, if I have people in a team sport environment, I
Yeah.
can work with them on that. Um, I'll usually do like kind of that plow, and I call it basically elementary school PE.
Yeah.
Is literally a circuit that I
Some
put
phys
on,
ed.
a prep circuit that I put on some of my athletes, like stuff where they'll go through like high knees and butt kicks and arm circles, and but it's, if I am working with like someone in team sports, I'm like, hey, go play tag with somebody. Like go kick a ball around.
Yeah.
It's like do things like that are going to be inherently reactive, where you don't have to think,
Mm-hmm.
and you can just kind of let your body take over in space. And um because I do think there's a lot of value to that. Like that's something like Joel and I have talked about, even Jake and I have talked about, where it's just like I love his like concept of like spike ball as a warm up. Like it's like
Yes.
and like even like Austin Jockham's another guy who posts a lot of stuff where they're just like jumping over stuff and balancing on stuff and doing somersaults and all this
It's
stuff. And it's like,
awesome. Like,
yeah, and it's just like, I mean, what's a warm up? What's the point of a warm up is get warm, right? It's like
mhm.
a few months ago I posted myself doing like figure eight drills with the med ball, and I was
Mhm.
like, is this a valuable warm up? And made a yes no poll on it, and it was about 50-50. And it's like, well, it got me warm.
Mhm.
So
you probably got some range of motion.
yeah, I had to shift my hips. I went through full femoral internal external rotation. Like through that process, I was rotating my rib cage contralaterally. Like the fact that, you know, some of the biomechanics people said no when they watched what was actually happening was like, oh, you don't actually know that much about what you're talking about if you can't see these patterns within this exercise.
Right.
And you know where I got that from? My 8-year-old skill development class when I was watching him work with his basketball coaches.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching all these kids do it without thinking about them, watching their hips shift and like rotating their bodies around. And I'm like, it's fucking great.
Yeah. That's something I really want to get into, especially talking to Joel. I'm going to start looking at some high schools and see if I can get into some, just like be a assistant coach or something like that. I think that would be cool super fun.
And I think high school kid, like that's where you want to get kids.
Yeah.
Cause at the college level, you've got basically like the survivorship bias when you get into college, like even small colleges, like those are players who were very good at a lower level at that point in any sport.
There's Mount St. Joseph here in Cincinnati. It's a D3 school and it's still super competitive. It's like,
it's like those, like any level of collegiate sports, like you're getting people who were very good at a lower level. Right. And it's like, you can make a difference, but you're also working with people who are already kind of in upper echelon of athletic ability probably. But if you can get people in high school and maybe even middle school, just with some foundational stuff, right? Like just get middle school kids doing like an extensive warm-up series. Like I remember even back in high school, like we'd go through like all the like high knees and butt kicks and skips and all these things, but none of us knew why we were doing it. We thought it was just a waste of time. So we just half-assed our way through it. Now looking back and I'm like, oh, it's like extensives to intensives.
Right.
You know, it's like, I wish I would have spent more time doing that stuff. Like, you know, with some intention behind it, instead of it just being like, oh yeah, this is the 5 minutes before, practice that we're just kind of wasting time and getting loose.
But, you know, that's again, making it fun, especially for kids. I remember running cross country. We would have these days where it was like every other week we would do this. Instead of Indian runs, we would do this like circuit where there was a frisbee, a soccer ball, all this different stuff. You had to like throw the frisbee, run, pick it up, throw it again. And like those days, I mean, I wasn't amazing. I broke 18 minutes on my 5K, which was, you know, pretty good, but there are still guys, I mean, they would crush me, you know, hitting like 16s, 15s on 5K, like super fast. But by the time, whenever we would do these like interval based sport type drills or like workout days, I would crush everyone. And like, I always got like most athletic, like pinned on my shirt. I was like, cool, great. But it's like, that meant way more to me. There was more like of a competition aspect to that. And it was, I don't know, there's just something about like actually having that game versus I'm just going to trudge along and run these tempo runs or this, you know, 60 minutes of duration and just like so boring.
Have you ever read Born to Run? That book? It probably came out like
I've heard of it. I just
10 years ago. So the book actually started like the barefoot running movement, which is whatever. Right. I don't really have an opinion on that. But the tribe that they based it off of in South America was this tribe where, I mean, the men and women in this tribe, like they would run 20 to 25 miles a day, like through the rainforest. Right. And they would do it. They had these, I forgot what they were called, but like these small balls that were like probably the size of like baseballs or tennis balls. And they would kick them the whole time they were doing it and try to keep them on the trail and pass them back and forth. And they gamified the process. And they made a game out of the running process and the hunting process through that and the foraging and whatever. So that reminded me of that, because it's like that's what kept them occupied and kept their intention high through that process.
Oh yeah. Well, and you know, I think that's why trail running has gotten so big in comparison. I mean, if I go run, I only run trails because if I run on a soccer field, I can't do it anymore. It's maddening. Yeah.
It is tough. Yeah. You need a distraction. Maybe that again,
maybe a task.
And like maybe that's flow state based, maybe that's whatever. Like there's probably some flow aspect to that where it's just like you need to find a way to distract your mind or be thinking about something else through that
Right.
process. Or else all you're going to be thinking about is how much it sucks.
Exactly.
Right. Like when I ran track, there's nothing worse than watching like a 3,000 or a 5,000 on a track. Like, can you even imagine that? Like, you're just watching just run this track for 13, 15 laps,
even 800s, man. Like 800s.
It's tough,
400 I could do. I was fantastic at 400. You made me run at 800 and I was like, nope.
I ran the 4 and the 8, but anything over an 8, like a mile, like no, like that third lap was fucking brutal. Like I wanted no part of it. It's just like my oldest who just turned 11, like watching kids that age run a mile is like, you're just like, it never ends, and I'm just like, oh, they're short little legs. It's just, you feel so bad for them. I'm just like, oh God.
Yeah.
Oof. He comes out, he's like, man, I don't like the mile. I was like, nobody likes the mile. Like, I don't like it either.
I don't like watching you do that.
Yeah, I was like, that is 7 minutes of torture, bro. Like,
that's painful to watch. Well, Kyle, hey man, it was awesome having you on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know we went a little bit over, but how about you hit us with the socials? Hit us with any programs you got, and we'll sign off there.
Yeah. So most of what I do is definitely on Instagram. We're slowly trying to get on YouTube stuff, man. I respect anyone who can make YouTube happen because that's a time spend. But we're trying to get onto that and do more longer form content with that. But my personal Instagram is Compound Performance with an underscore after it. Then we have the Compound app, which is Get Compound at Get Compound, and that's going to be more of our technology based, trainer solution based page. And then our website with all of our stuff is just www.compoundperformance.com. And you'll find everything there. We have individual programs. We have group programs for both education and training. If you ever want to know more about that, just shoot me a DM. It's the easiest way to reach me probably. And then I can direct you to the right places after that.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you all for listening. And we will see you all in the next one. This episode is brought to you by the Broken to Beast protocol. This is a program that is meant for you. It's to help you gain muscle, get jacked, but without putting all of the excess stress on your joints. We've got video tutorials for every single exercise. We have a self-assessment to make sure that you're doing the right warm-ups and exercises for your body. We really try to take the exercise and build it out so that way it is set for your body type versus trying to make your body fit to the exercise. So again, you want to check this out over on Instagram. It is at Broken to Beast. That is Broken, the number 2 Beast. Check it out on Instagram. Join the newsletter for it. It will be out this month in May. Don't miss out on it. We'll have an early bird special for all those folks that have been waiting.